بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين أما بعد. In these two sessions بإذن الله تبارك وتعالى, from today and tomorrow, we'll be going through this manzūma, this poem on al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. It's a very important science from the sciences that branch out of al-Fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. We'll be going through that inshaAllah ta'ala in these 2 days bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. Before we start, we want to try and cover bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala in today's session. I just want to break down how we'll be going through things inshaAllah ta'ala. The first part will be an introduction on the sciences of al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. So we aren't really going to use the book, we're going to be working away from the book inshaAllah ta'ala. So we're going to introduce the science of al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah by focusing on what Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah are. So what's the definition of this science, as well as trying to understand how it differs to things like usul al-fiqh and furu' al-fiqh, or al-fiqh in general. We also want to try and discover its importance. Why is it so essential that we know these qawāʿid? And the author of this poem will also reiterate that as we get through to that inshaAllah ta'ala as well. We're also going to look at some of the sources of these qawāʿid. Where do they even come from? To understand better the importance of these qawāʿid. Where did they come from? So as to why you should give importance to them. We'll also look at its categories. So not all qawāʿid are on the same level, as we'll see inshaAllah ta'ala. We have the 5 major legal maxims, al-Qawāʿid al-Kulliyya al-Kubra. Don't worry about it right now, we're going to go through that, and the author rahimahullah ta'ala mentions them as well, and these are the ones that he begins with, the 5 major qawāʿid. And you have qawāʿid that are tabi'ah, meaning they offshoot from them, and then you have just literally separate principles entirely. And so we're going to look at all of that inshaAllah ta'ala, the universal maxims as well as those that branch. The last issue that I'll try and get through inshaAllah ta'ala with this 1.5 hours so we've got right now till Maghrib is, and if we can get to it inshaAllah ta'ala before we start the Nadhm, is its practical application. What are you supposed to do with these qawāʿid? So you've learned Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. How do you then apply them? Are you allowed to use it for istidlal, for example? Is it an evidence? Can you use them as you use the Quran and the Sunnah to apply it so that you can gain rulings and then تَتَعَبَّدْ لِلَّهِ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى بِهَا, that you then go and worship Allah تبارك وتعالى with those rulings? Are you allowed to do that? And so that will be the last question that we will go through inshaAllah ta'ala, hopefully all of that before Salat al-Maghrib. And then inshaAllah ta'ala by the end of this evening, we'll go through each couplet, each 2 lines of the verses of the poem, and we'll try and cover the first 23 lines. They pretty much just consist of 3 qawāʿid and a number of offshooting qawāʿid. And one of the things that inshaAllah ta'ala you'll see inshaAllah ta'ala as we go through the book and as we go through the muqaddimah is the variations in the principles. They're not as important as each other. Some will be more important. If you grasp that, alhamdulillah. Some of the ones that offshoot, they may be more complex and difficult to get your head round. We won't really focus on that too much. It is a beginner's class, as we are all aware of. We'll try as well as we go through the Nadhm, we'll try and break down keywords, terminologies of course, provide, sort of examples, both from the classical fiqh as well as maybe contemporary examples that we can benefit from, inshaAllah ta'ala, and also maybe address sometimes how it's misused. Misconceptions with these qawāʿid and how it's misused as well, so that we can apply it in a more thorough manner as we move on from these lessons inshaAllah ta'ala. So we're going to start now with the first portion of our class, which is the introduction to ilm al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. What is al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah? Al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is what we refer to as alamun murakkab. It's a term that basically 2 things that have been stuck together by way of an idafa, conjugation and the like. Right? There's 2 things that have been connected. It's a bit like usul al-fiqh, right? Ulum al-Quran. You have to break down these terminologies. usul al-hadith, mustalah al-hadith. You have to understand each of these terminologies individually and then understand. Then after that we can know together what do they mean. So alam al-murakkab, the first thing that you do is you basically go about it by breaking it down into its half and saying qa'idah. What is the meaning of qa'idah? And then you say what is the meaning of al-fiqh? And then you combine between the two and you say what is the meaning of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Does that make sense? So we're going to go through it like that. What is the first definition that we have to understand? Qa'idah. What is al-qa'idah? What is al-qa'idah? I won't bore you with the details. Al-qawāʿidu min al-nisa and the ayat that come regarding the term, the usage of the term qawāʿid. Right? Forget about all the details of how it comes in the Quran and the Sunnah. The people of Lugha, in the Arabic language, they say linguistically it means al-asas. Al-asas, which is the foundation. It is the foundation. It is the foundation. Qawāʿid is the plural. So linguistically, qa'idah is a foundation that other things are built upon or added onto, on top of it. Other things come on top of it. Qawāʿidul bayt ay asasuhu. Right, the foundations of a house, they are the basis of it, that everything else of the house comes on top. Istilahan, its usage as an Islamic terminology, quite simply, it just consists of two terms. But I want you to really understand these two terms, bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala. Istilahan, they define it as al-qadhiyyah al-kulliyah. Al-qadhiyyah al-kulliyah. The question then is, what is al-qadhiyyah and what is al-kulliyah? Qadhiyyah, and this is now getting just a little bit philosophical, nothing to stress about, but they define it as ما احتمل أو ما يحتمل الصدق لذاته. ما يحتمل الصدق لذاته. In the breakdown of sentences in the Arabic language, we have two types of sentence formats. You have what is known as a khabar, and you have what is known as an insha. Quite simply, a khabar is something that is informative. Something that is informative. It's like me saying to you, right, this happened today. You consider this a khabar, you consider this an information. This happened today. It's also referred to as a qadhiyyah. A qadhiyyah. The opposite of it is a insha. Insha is not informative. Insha are commands and questions and things like that. So it's like me saying to you, stand up, or sit down, or how are you? Does that make sense? You're seeking something, insha, right? It requires a response to it. So the difference between the two is, and this is just a little bit, I'll be slightly a little bit to get your head around. The first type of sentence structure, it bears truth and falsehood. If I tell you something, if I inform you of something, it can be what? It can be true or false. If I ask you something or tell you to do something, can it be true or false? So this is how we define the two, khabar and insha. Another way of referring to khabar is al-qadhiyyah. So quite simply say, number one, a principle is an informative sentence. It tells us something. Does that make sense? The second clause in defining what principles are, qawāʿid. Number two is that they are kulliyah. They are kulliyah. Kulliyah are, it means that it's comprehensive or universal, encompassing. It applies to more than one thing, right? So in informative sentences, you can have two scenarios. I can inform you of a thing that applies to one thing and one thing only. I can say, for example, this black pen, for example, the ink runs out quickly, right? I'm informing you of something specific. Or I can say to you, all black pens, the ink dries quickly. Not saying that's true. But the second I say all black pens, I've created what? A kulliyah. I've created a principle. I've applied it to a range of stuff. So I informed you something that can be applied to a range of things. Is this clear? Anybody struggled with that? Anybody? I'll repeat it with another example. Is it clear or? It's clear. So we understand what principles are. Principles quite simply are defined in Islamic terminology as al-Qawāʿid al-Kulliyah. So if you want to say a universal, informative statement. And a generic, informative statement that tells us something about more than one thing. Tells us about more than one thing. This is quite simply what qadiyya, what qaida means from a philosophical perspective or in the Islamic terminology. So we'll see bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala that the principles we're going to study are going to be generic and they're going to inform us about things. They're going to tell us something about that. Just a quick example of the qaida we're going to take today. Al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak. Certainty is not removed by way of doubt. So whenever you have certainty of something, or you've got the default position with regards to something, let's say you're tahara, right? And you want to pray right now. You doubt whether you broke your wudu. The essence is that your wudu still remains because that was the certainty. That was the default position. And so now this principle is there. It's generic. It informs us. You as a student, what is the only thing that you really need to know? How to apply them. It's simple. The only difficulty is learning a little bit of details as it relates to each principle, and then you'll be able to apply it more and more and gain the benefits of this science. Al-Fiqhiyyah is the next part of it. So we've understood everything to do with qaida, the principle. The principle here is referred to as al-Fiqhiyyah. If you want to refer to it as well, maxims. That's fine as well. Fiqhiyyah is an attribute to the science of al-fiqh. Nisbatun ila ilm al-fiqh. It's an attribute to the science of fiqh. What is al-fiqh fil lughah? What is the meaning of fiqh in the Arabic language? The people of knowledge vary, but they all revolve around the meaning of al-fahm, understanding. Some say fahm generically, some say al-fahm al-daqiq. Doesn't really concern us right now. In the Arabic language, faqihtu shay'a ay fahimtuhu. I understood something. That's how it's used, and the people of knowledge vary in the precise usage of it, but it's to do with understanding generically. As it relates to the science of al-fiqh, we refer to it as, here we've got a whole ta'rif that requires a bit of a breakdown. What we did with qadiyya kulliyah, we have to try and understand each part of the ta'rif. We have to do this again, even though this one is just a little bit longer, but just jot it down anyway. We'll look at it individually. Number one, we say al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-shar'iyyah al-far'iyyah an adillatiha التفصيلية بالاستدلال. العلم بالأحكام الشرعية الفرعية عن أدلتها التفصيلية بالاستدلال. This is the definition that was brought about by Ibn Hajib. Now, here we're going to break it down, inshaAllah ta'ala. Number one, al-ilm. So knowledge, or you could say the science that deals with, right? So the knowledge of, the knowledge regarding. What is this knowledge regarding? Number one is to do with al-ahkam. Al-ahkam. So it's to do with rulings. This knowledge doesn't have to do with the what? Individuals. So the knowledge of fiqh doesn't deal with individuals, you know. Who is this person? Is he trustworthy or is he not? That's nothing to do with that. It's a ruling. It's an Islamic ruling. It doesn't deal with attributes of people. It doesn't deal with actions. In essence, it deals with Islamic rulings and attaching it to scenarios. So number two is, so we've got ahkam, and al-hukum is a ruling. These rulings are shar'iyyah. meaning that they are established by way of the Sharia, the legislation of Allah. They are not grammatical rules. They are not medical rules. They are not philosophical rules. Does that make sense? They are Islamic legislatory rules. So al-ilm bil-ahkam al-shar'iyyah. Next, we have al-Far'iyyah. And al-Far'iyyah, it's supposed to remove two things. Number one, al-Usuliyyah and al-I'tiqadiyyah. Usuliyyah are the fundamentals that allow you to reach those individual rulings. And so they are to do with the generic principles or the rules that allow us to derive rulings. This is not the generic principles. These are individual principles. Meaning, what is the ruling of this action and that action? Al-ilm bil-ahkam al-shar'iyyah al-far'iyyah. Al-far'iyyah, just jot down individual rulings. Individual rulings. What do we mean by individual rulings? We mean that they are not generic rulings. The difference between a generic ruling and an individual rule is, a generic rule is like, for example, every single command shows obligation. That's a generic principle. Where do we place this? Usul. That's a generic study of what this hukum relates to. Every single command in the Quran and Sunnah, the essence is that it shows that this thing is wajib. It's obligatory. But that is not what we're studying in fiqh. That's what we study in usul. Okay? In fiqh, we study individuals' rulings. So you say, for example, what is the ruling to do with Salat al-Asr? Salat al-Asr is wajib. That is an isolated and an individual fiqhi rule. Right? It's not to do with a broad range of things. It's to do with a specific thing. So that is what the science of fiqh deals with, al-Far'iyyah. We said it's individual rulings. If you could jot down one example, it usually helps. And trust me, this is the only boring part. The next part will be a little bit more easier. It gets a lot easier from here, bi'idhnillah. And it also, the second thing that we exclude from this is anything that relates to aqeedah as well. Far'iyyah, meaning it's not aqeedah based. Anything that is credo based is not a far'i issue. It's not an individual. It's a matter of belief. And so that is also not an individual and an isolated rule. The Ibn al-Hajib also adds on that how we derive those rulings as well are important. So he adds on, min adillatiha at-tafsiliyah. So these rulings are taken from individual evidences. Wa aqimus salah shows that salah is wajibah. Does that make sense? So individual evidences and what they show and inflect. And lastly, bilistidlal, that we derive at those rulings by way of istidlal, by following the framework of evidences and deducing rulings from evidences, taking rulings out from evidences. The people of knowledge add this clause on to exclude things from the science of fiqh that we know just by way of necessity. Say sometimes it's not included in the science of fiqh. We'll exclude that one for now, al-ilm al-daruri and al-ilm al-nadari wal-istidlal. But the second one is sometimes we say that this exclude things like the knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ, yuha ilayh, he was revealed unto. And so his way of deriving rulings was not the framework of fiqh that you and I would follow. Does that make sense? His framework was revelation. He's in a different, this concept of ijtihad in this manner did not apply to him in the same way it applied to us. So, Jibreel and the Prophet ﷺ, the knowledge that they had varies entirely to the knowledge I had. And so this is one of the things that some of these scholars wanted to exclude. Going back to, so we understand what fiqh is now in a bit more detail than probably I had wanted, but that's a very nice definition, and hopefully you can keep it for lessons to come, inshallah ta'ala. Just reuse it when you start studying the science of fiqh as well. We move on now to, remember we said we break down Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah into two halves, Qāʿida, Fiqhiyyah. Now we need to stick it together and understand what it means. If you were to stick it together, you simply get قاعدة or قضية كلية فقهية. So it's a universal principle that deals with fiqh related issues. So everything that we're going to be studying across the next 2 days are not individual or isolated issues. They are generic. They inform us regarding certain rulings, and they inform us regarding individual rulings of fiqh. Does that make sense? So it's basically just the string that connects to all of the different fiqh issues that you'd cover across various different chapters. And examples of it we're going to see loads of, inshallah ta'ala, as we get through bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala. There is a slight topic that is discussed here, which is, do these principles have exceptions, and how do we approach those exceptions? Lengthy topic, we'll ignore it for now, inshallah ta'ala, due to time restraints, but remember that. In the back of your head, remember there's a whole science that deals with that. And it's not Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, it's actually an offshoot of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, and we refer to it as ilm. Anybody have any idea? Anybody have any idea? The science that deals with the exceptions to these universal principles. Al-Ashbāh wal-Nadhā'ir. These are whole books in the science of fiqh. So what it is that you're going to learn in this science today principles that you then go and apply to every single scenario that you can think of. Apply it to everything under the sun. Okay? And then the scholars of Islam discuss certain issues that they differ over, which should have entered under the qaida, but maybe some scholars differ and disagree, and that is discussed isolatedly and individually. It has works that deal with that. The point of me mentioning is that the concept of ilm al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is a very robust system. Every single fiqh issue that could possibly enter into it was discussed. It's a mechanism and a system that left nothing, amiss. And it goes to show you that these rulings that you apply, especially if they're madhab based, they were very heavily discussed and very thoroughly investigated before they found themselves in books. Does that make sense? Every single one of those issues was heavily looked into. Even if there was an exception, we had to find an explanation of why we couldn't include it into the generic rule. And so these rules are very important. The exceptions are very important. And for you to understand the whole framework of fiqh is very important, because the scholars gave a lot of time and effort and emphasis to this. And we will just ignore this topic of the exceptions of these rules for now. The next thing that I want to quite quickly bring to your attention is, how did we get to these principles? What is the story of these qawāʿid? Okay? So now we're going to look at it from the 3 layers of fiqh and where Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah fits in with regards to this. Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah fits in as the last layer of fiqh. And so it's the outer layer. So now we're going to have three sciences, and we're going to talk about them in the role of where they play, what role they play in fiqh issues, rulings in Islam. So the first one is usul al-fiqh. So you've got, right now, let's say usuli entered the room. What would his job be? His job would be providing the tools that you can then take the rulings out of the Quran and Sunnah with. The usuli gives us the principles that we can then take out rulings from the Quran and Sunnah from, and also studying the legitimacy, the authenticity, the correctness, the validity of these principles. So right now, the same way as if you were to go right now, I don't know, let's say you had a farmer, and let's say you had a farmer, and he wanted, before he started farming, he wanted to go and buy, I don't know, the equipment that he would require to, sort out his farm. Goes buys a tractor and this and that to rearrange his farm so that it's suitable for planting seeds and growing crops and so on. Does that make sense? And so he gets those tools and he fixes it up. Who does that job? The usuli, the science of usul fiqh does that, which is almost like preparing the landscape for fiqh. How are you then able to harvest from that land? The science that allows you for that allows you to do that, we refer to it as the science of usul fiqh. Then comes the next person. And he is the faqih, scholar of fiqh. Walks in, and in that scenario of the farm, he makes sure that each area plants the seeds and, harvests crops from it. Does that make sense? And then he picks out all of those crops and he takes it out. The faqih is the one who takes out those rulings by way of those principles that were given to him, the tools that were given to him by the usuli. Now we basically have a space where we've got all these different rulings. Say an average book in fiqh has thousands of rulings. Right? The third layer after that is somebody comes along and he sorts out all of those different crops and he groups it together. So in the case of a farm, for example, you put all the apples together and all tomatoes and this and that, you group them together. So the person that is sorting them is Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. He finds the commonality between all of those isolated issues of fiqh. And so that is the last layer of fiqh. So this is what we refer to as grouping together all of those individual rulings that were derived by way of the faqih, utilizing the tools that were given to him by the usuli. Does that make sense? And so Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is about sorting out these rulings and grouping them together and finding these topics of commonality between them. The author of the poem has a very beautiful point that he'll mention and talk about with regards to this issue of the commonality that exists in the science of fiqh and how that relates to Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, the greatness of Allah. And I'll leave that to the discussion once we get there, bi-idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. So in a nutshell, that is the phases that these rulings go through. Again, there are discussion that comes in here as well, which is referred to as furuq al-fiqhiyyah, but we'll leave that as well for the time being. The next issue that I want to talk about is referred to as anwa' qawa'id al-fiqhiyyah. So now we're going to talk about the categories of the science of qawa'id al-fiqhiyyah. How do we categorize it? There are a number of different ways that the scholars of Islam categorize these principles. There is one particularly famous way, but we'll mention as many different ways because we can benefit. All of these different categorizations will give us a greater deal of insight and understanding into what Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is. There is a way of categorizing them that is referred to as min hayth shumūluhā lil-furūዕ, meaning how it encompasses all of the different individual rulings of al-Islam. So how does it all cover and include all of these different rulings? We have what is referred to as, number one, Qawāʿid Kulliyyah Kubra. Qawāʿid Kulliyyah Kubra. And they are the five, as we'll see inshaAllah ta'ala, they are the five major principles. And these five major principles are firstly, the first unique quality is that they are almost applicable to almost anything. And the second thing about them is that they have almost like sub-principles. So to truly apply them, you have to learn about these sub-principles that come underneath them. These are almost, if you gain nothing from these classes, except if you understand these five principles from the science, it's more than enough. You've achieved the purpose of this science. Everything else is, sometimes it's topic of debate and so on. What are these 5 principles? Jot them down quickly. Number 1, al-umuru bimaqasidiha. Al-umuru bimaqasidiha. Which is quite simply, innama al-a'malu binniyat. Actions are determined by way of your intentions. So anything, any ruling of anything is attached to the intention of the doer. The intention of the doer. That's all it means. Al-umuru bimaqasidiha. The second is al-yaqinu la yazulu bil-shak. Al-yaqinu la yazulu bil-shak. That certainty is not removed by way of doubt. The default position is not absolved, it's not lifted up by way of doubt. La yazulu bil-shak. La yazulu bil-shak. The third principle is al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That difficulty and hardship, it brings about ease. Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala from His rule is, if something's too difficult, there's something lighter and easier that is put in place in that scenario. And again, you can see just by looking at the phrasing of that, you're like, that's very broad. How do I actually apply that? Well, this is why it's called Qawāʿid Kulliyya Kubra, because there's always these sub-principles that you have to learn so that you can apply them in a correct manner. Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That difficulty begets, and as a result of that, the Sharia introduces a level of ease. A level of ease. The fourth is al-dararu yuzal. Al-dararu yuzal. That harm is removed. It must be removed. The fifth is al-'adatu muhakkama. Al-'adatu muhakkama. That the cultural norms and traditions, muhakkama, that it has a role in Islamic rules. And it has a vital role that it plays and you apply to it. The next category is what we refer to as al-Qawāʿid al-Kulliyya as-Sughra. Qawāʿid Kulliyya as-Sughra. This category of principles are still the same, meaning that you, by learning this principle, you keep it with you. From the beginning of Kitab al-Tahara all the way till whatever book you study, depending on the madhab, Kitab al-'Itq for most madhab, of the books of fiqh. From the very beginning of the books of fiqh all the way to the end, these principles remain with you. So you have to remember them and they'll apply. The difference is, number 1, its application is less common. It's less common. So its commonality, how frequently, Kulliyya Sughra, it's less common. It's not going to be so reoccurring. You could open a fiqh book today, you could find multiple examples in everything that you study in the very first chapter of how those 5 principles apply. These principles, they're not so commonly used. They include things like al-ijtihad, la yanqudu bil-ijtihad, right? One ijtihad doesn't overpower the other ijtihad, doesn't remove the other ijtihad, right? If you two people, neither of you knew where the qibla was, for example, you don't have the right to force, your salah is batil, you don't have a right to that, because you both attempted to find the truth. And you still take it with you all the way to the end of Kitab al-Jinayat. If a qadi makes an ijtihad and applies a rule, and for example, another qadi does something different, or the qadi himself changes his opinion, but both of them were built upon him trying to derive at the truth, they don't counteract each other, they don't remove each other, because they were both attempts. And as long as the attempt was valid, then they were both sound. And so la yanqud, it does not destroy, does not remove, does not repel the other ijtihad. The point is, how commonly are you going to use that principle? Once here, once there, Whereas the first 5, it's a lot more frequent. As we'll see inshallah ta'ala, it comes up everywhere. You just need to keep, once we get through these classes, you're going to see it, we're going to be more alert. And you're going to see how frequently it comes up. But these other principles, they're not that frequent. They're quite rare in comparison to the ones before. The other difference that the people of knowledge mention is that they also don't have sub-principles. They don't have sub-principles. So the first difference between the first category and the second category is commonality. And the second one is they do not have sub-principles. The first group does. Is that clear?
Yes.
And then after that, we have, so if you wanted to, you could say that first two principles, قواعد كلية كبرى, قواعد كلية صغرى, you group them together, you say قواعد الكلية. These are universal principles. But we said already, all قواعد are كلية. The people of knowledge, just to clarify, they add on something here. It's not to do with قواعد الفقهية, it's a whole separate science. But it's very important for us to be aware of, and that is that you include in here, not to do with قواعد الفقهية, but it comes under it, we have what is referred to as ضوابط فقهية. What's a ضابط فقهي? ضابط فقهي is not a principle, meaning it's not generic. It's not so universal that you can apply it from the beginning of fiqh to the end. The difference is it only applies to one chapter. So it's a principle, meaning it has multiple functions, multiple masail come under it, but maybe it's limited to kitab al-nikah. Maybe it's limited to tahara. Maybe it's limited to salah, right? So if a principle is limited to one chapter, we call it ضوابط فقهية. قواعد فقهية, what did we say? Universal. Applies from the beginning of fiqh all the way to the end. The first two categories, remember we said كلية كبرى, كلية صغرى. That's why we emphasize كلية. They apply everywhere. The beginning of fiqh all the way to the end, you apply, you apply, you apply. It's just these are principles that are never, they're always giving us more examples and more applications. These ضوابط فقهية don't do that. They only apply to one chapter at a time. And inshallah, the only reason why I really want to mention this, inshallah ta'ala, is because we are going to see some examples of them, and I don't want you to conflate them with Qawāʿid. The author mentions them, but he'll mention them as, it's almost like him having said, there is a principle, there are sub-principles, right? And there are sub-sort of principles. The sub-principles are principles that only apply to one chapter. They are ضوابط فقهية, okay? All of that is to do with how we can categorize قواعد الفقهية من حيث الشمول, with regards to its generality and its commonality, meaning how encompassing is of different furu', of different rulings. We have another way of categorizing these principles, and they kind of overlap with the previous thing that I mentioned, and that is that we also define principles as from the aspect of al-istiqlaliyah, meaning its independence, almost freedom. It's almost separate. It's different. And we split them into two types with regards to that. قواعد مستقلة and قواعد تابعة. So here as well, as we go through the science of قواعد الفقهية, we will have to go through it from the lens of, is this principle a separate and individual principle? Or does it come under another principle? What I said earlier, remember what I said about قواعد كلية كبرى? They have principles underneath them. So these principles we refer to, the ones underneath, we refer to them as قواعد تابعة, principles that follow and they come under a more generic principle, right? As for the principles that are individual, they're just separate. قواعد كلية صغرى, for example, they don't come under a more generic theme. They're referred to as قواعد مستقلة, independent principles. They're just different, they're separate. And it's very important for us to identify them. Why is it important for us to identify them? We're going to talk about that. But a huge reason is, for example, sometimes when you're studying a qa'idah, for example, you come across a qa'idah that comes under a principle. I'll give you an example so that it's better applied. You find, for example, in Kitab al-Ayman wal-Nudhur, from the chapters of fiqh, right, to do with oaths and vows. Somebody says wallahi, or he takes an oath by Allah. There are issues, khilafat, that occur between the scholars of Islam, and it goes back to what the principle of the madhab is. So for example, they'll say, هل العبرة بالأيمان بالأغراض أو الألفاظ? So say for example, somebody said, Wallahi, I'm not going to enter this room because he was angry at Tanweer, for example. Right? Nobody gets angry at Tanweer, but let's say he did. And what he meant was, he's not going to come today. His intention was, I'm not going to walk through this room today. But the way he had, made the oath that he took by Allah was generic. Wallah, I'm not going to enter this room. You could understand it as, I'm never going to enter this room. Right? Here the scholars of Islam differ. So they would say, the ruling here to do with this oath, does it go back to his intention? Or does it go back to the wording? Does that make sense? The words that came out of his mouth. This principle is a principle, it's a legit principle. And depending on the madhab, some people will say, al-ibratu bil-ayman bil-alfaz. And some will say, al-ibratu bil-ayman bil-aghrad. Right? It goes back to intentions, it goes back to the wording. What principle is an offshoot of? Al-umur bil-maqasidiha is to do with intentions. Right? It's to do with innamal a'malu bin-niyat. Does intentions have an application with his yameen? That is the question. Right? So, for example, the arguments for the group that will say it's the intention that counts are the same arguments for what? Al-umur bil-maqasidiha, the rule of intentions, right? The rule of intentions and the evidences for it are the same. And so if you as a student of knowledge are not able to take back that individual principle to its mother principle, you're also not going to understand the evidences. Does that make sense? So this is very important. This is why some of the scholars identify and they inform us as well. As you go through books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, they'll say you have to know which principles are independent, they're separate. Because then you have to learn independent adillah for these principles. What are the proofs for this principle? For it to be valid. And which principles are not independent, meaning they come under a broader principle and a theme, and so it goes back the evidences for, that principle is the same as its mother here. It's the same as the broader principle, and so you have to have knowledge of that for you to understand these principles properly. Do you want to take another example, or is that clear?
One more example.
One more example, no problem.
You can apply, keeping both mustaqillah and tabi'ah in mind.
No problem. So let's do the tabi'ah once more, then we'll take mustaqillah again. The scholars of Islam say, for example, إنما تعتبر العادة إذا اضطردت أو غلبت. Principle, which is the customs that the Sharia gives credence to, is accepted, is the custom that is prevalent and common in society. Somebody comes along and he says, this is my culture. It might be his culture, it might be the culture of his community. Let's say, for example, just to give a hypothetical scenario. Let's say Muhammad Rahim went to the souk today and he bought a bed. Yeah, bought a newborn bed. Let's say the cultures in the lands vary. Some countries, you get free delivery, right? In other countries, you have to collect it yourself or you pay extra for it to be delivered to your house. It goes back to where you are. What is the norm of that society? Does this free delivery come with this buying of this product or does it not? Right? Now, say Muhammad argued, again, not somebody argues, but let's say he did. He said, our norm is that you have to deliver it. And the person turned around and said, what norm? I don't believe in that norm. Does that make sense? So who's right in this scenario? You look towards that society, what is prevalent? What is the norm? And so if the norm is that in all of Kuwait, all those people that live here, the norm and the standard is that if you buy these heavy sort of items, you get a free delivery with it, then that is the norm and he's the haqq. He has a right for a free delivery and he shouldn't have to pay for it. If it's not the norm, then you have to pay for it. You shouldn't expect it for free. Does that make sense? And so this is where the discussion of what's it called? إنما تعتبر العادة إذا اضطردت أو غلبت comes in. Prevalence in norms and customs.
إنما تعتبر العادة.
We're going to get to it, don't worry. But what is this principle an offshoot of?
العادة محكمة.
العادة المحكمة. That customs and the norms of society have a vital role in Islamic rulings. Does that make sense? Now, if you don't understand the evidences and the meaning of that original principle, then this scenario here is almost like a condition. It's a shart. It's a condition of applying this qa'id. Does that make sense? And so you're going to feel as if, where did this principle come from? You would read into the text of fiqh, I think, this is a line that sounds interesting. Does it relate specifically to this particular chapter of fiqh, or is it more broad? It is a generic principle. And so you wouldn't know because you don't understand the correlation that exists between the mother principle and the principles that offshoot from it. Does that make sense? So one last example, inshallah ta'ala, for a qa'idah that is mustaqillah. Let's take, for example, إعمال الكلام أولى من إهماله. We can take it as well, inshallah ta'ala, as we go through the Manẓūmat. He mentions it. إعمال الكلام. That for you to give a meaning to a statement is put before and given precedence to ignoring. Meaning that, say for example, an individual made two statements. Say there were two individual promises. We would say essentially that him emphasizing requires proof. Because the default position is that he intended two different meanings with this. A good scenario is what? If somebody said right now, so and so, like somebody was talking to his spouse, but then it said, anti taliq. Right? How many talaqs would you count that is? Why would you say?
How many times he said?
Say anti taliq twice. Two. So what gives you the rule that this is the default position?
The al-fadh.
But what about his words?
أنت طالق وأنت طالق ولا?
No, forget about the details. This is anti-talaq. Forget about the wow. He said, you're divorced twice. You're divorced, you're divorced. Huh?
Yes, to.
Forget about niyyah for a second. It goes back to school. Forget about that as well for a second. Based on what I told you, the principle. The principle says that for you to give meaning to each sentence that came out of his mouth is the essence of the Arabic language or any language. If I start saying things, for example, even qadhf right now, right? If you defame somebody by accusing them of something, and I do so multiple times, I'm deserving of what? Multiple punishments. So the asl is that your words match the consequences of it. You said it twice, it's twice, and so on. And you don't just group them together, you say it's once. And this is the principle that they use. The point is, my dear brothers, that this principle is nothing to do with intentions, nothing to do with anything. It's an isolated principle. And you need to study the concept of it and the evidence of it individually. So that again, you can apply it to talaq, you can apply it to li'an, you can apply it to all sorts of other chapters. Does that make sense? Is that a good example, or would you like something different?
An isolated principle means that it's not an offshoot of.
No, it's not an offshoot. You might sometimes assume, like the i'mal al-kalam does seem like it has something to do with al-umur al-maqasidiyah. There is an element of intentions there, because every sentence you intended it. That is the default position. But it doesn't, because it's actually to do with giving meaning to actual intentions. We don't care about your intentions. We just care about, say his intentions was one. We'd still say, the group that holds this principle, they would say each one is isolated, and so as a result of that should have separate consequences. Is that clear? Can we move on from this category, or is that clear? We'll see. We're going to inshallah see examples of it as we go through bi'idhnillahi tabaraka ta'ala. The next one is a very important one, which is we can categorize principles from the perspective of its masdar. تقسيمها من حيث المصدر. The meaning of that is, where do these principles come from? Where do these principles come from? So we split them into two types. The two types are principles that in essence are evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah. And there are principles that are rooted in evidence but they're not from a specific evidence. They are what you call mustanbata. So you study a range of evidences and you get to a generic principle based on understanding a whole group of evidences. So you deduce this principle from a range of evidences. Does that make sense? So for example, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are determined by way of the intention. We got that principle which was al-umuru bimaqasidiha, right? And then you study a range of al-kharaju bil-dhaman, for example, al-ghunmu bil-ghurm. You're going to see that as well. All of these principles are in essence a hadith. Some of them even debated over its sihha, its authenticity. But they are principles that are attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then you have principles that come as a result of, studying a range of different rulings and trying to stipulate something together from that. And some of what we mentioned moments ago is an example of that. You study the whole Sharia and you realize, hold on, all of these different, evidences show that the culture and the norms and the traditions and what's prevalent in society plays a role in these ahkam. So you say al-'adatu muhakkama. It's not an individual evidence that told us, that cultures play a role. We've seen it so much. In nikah, in buyu', in this, and the Prophet ﷺ, he would deal with marital issues and sales and this and that. And we see that the Sharia, it gives vital credence to cultures and norms and so on. The last issue or the last categorization that we'll look at bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala will be, and this is very important. This last one is very important. And that will be Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah min hayth al-ittifaq alayha aw adamihi. The Qawāʿid, these principles of fiqh, from the perspective of the scholarly stance. Do the scholars agree? The principles of fiqh, the categorization of the principles of fiqh as it relates to the scholar's stance towards it. Do they all agree? Do they unanimously agree that this is a valid principle, or do they debate over its authenticity and its validity? A good example, for example, is Qawāʿid al-Kuwiyya al-Kubra. Every single scholar, every single faqih says those 5 principles are valid, and they are correct, and they are grounded in evidence, and they are to be utilized in your study of fiqh. Does that make sense? And there are principles that the scholars of Islam debate. And then you'll see something. And this is now min bab al-fa'ida. One of the things you notice, you won't see it so much in the Nadhm, because the Nadhm is a Nadhm. It's a poem at the end of the day. But if you were to grab a little bit of a bigger book in Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, one of the beautiful things that the scholars do is, when it comes to Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, is when a qa'idah is mahal khilaf, it's a point of contention, they differ regarding is, they started off with a question. So instead of giving us, remember what we said, you give a generic informative statement. That's what a principle is, right? Al-umuru bimaqasidiha, al-dhararu yuzal. These are just principles. But when the principle is a point of contention, they differ in it, they do something very interesting, which is they give us that principle in a questionary form, an inquisitive form. They'll say, for example, هل العبرة, remember the principle we said about the vows, the oaths. هل العبرة بالأيمان بالألفاظ أو الأغراض? Is what determines the rule with regards to oaths. Is it intentions or is it words? So that's not a principle, it's a question. Right? You would think, hold on, I thought Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah was all about, giving us a principle. This is no longer a principle, it's a question. But why did the scholars give you that question?
They differed upon.
Because they wanted to teach you that they differ with regards to that principle. So once you start reading into it, you realize, hold on, okay, there's a group here that believes it's based on words. There's another group here that holds it's based on intentions. And so there is that range, and as a result of that, you get this question that comes from that. Another good example would be هل العبرة في العقود بالمقاصد والمعاني أو بالألفاظ والمباني. عقود in general, which is all contracts, right? Are they based on the words that you utter, or are they based on, contracts, Islamic contracts? Are they based on intentions or are they based on the words? Because sometimes there can be a variation. Your intention might be more specific, more generic. Depending on the madhab that you take, there will be a variation. Okay? So, for example, if the madhab you followed was that your vows go back to your intention, how would they phrase it?
Again, sorry?
If the madhab you followed, say you was a Hanbali, that believed that your yameen, your oath that you took, Wallah, I'm not going to do this, needs to match your intention. Right? They say, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ is applied here. How would they phrase this question? They would switch it. They would remove the hal. Hal, you tend to find it in the more difficult. It comes in two scenarios. Either if you're studying it in a book where the madhab itself is, two schools of thoughts within the madhab, they differ, you'll see that question. Or you'll come across that question in books that deal with Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah across different madhahib to show that the scholars of different schools, they differed. As for if the madhab itself agrees on that, they will say, for example, al-ibratu bil-ayman bil-aghrāq, al-ibratu bil-ayman bil-maqāsid. That how we determine, the rule of oaths is by intention. Whatever you intended, even if the words were wrong, we don't give consideration to that. And so the madhab will give clarity to that, showing that what their stance is with regards to that. So the inquisitive form is very important as it relates to the whole concept of al-ittifaq wal-ikhtilaf, because it's almost like it's a subtle way, it's a hidden way of sharing the difference of the scholars of Islam with regards to this issue. The last issue, inshallah ta'ala, that we'll try and cover bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. How much time do we have left? About half an hour. Khalas. Half an hour and then we'll start another. This won't take half an hour, alhamdulillah. So we skip through a number of issues anyway. The next issue that we'll go through bi-idhnillahi ta'ala is what we refer to as Hujjiyyat al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Hujjiyyat al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. And I want your sort of ideas or your thoughts on this. The question is, do the scholars of Islam use these principles to extract rulings that relate to the Sharia? So for example, if there was a hukum, there was a scenario, a scholar didn't know the ruling of it by way of its evidence, but he knows a qa'idah that might be applicable. Does he go and apply that application? Remember what we said moments ago? The story of fiqh, the journey of fiqh, how fiqh got to us, Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is at the end. The ruling was already there. Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is quite simply, in essence, it's a string that attaches and connects between a range of rulings. Can you then change the function of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah and apply it to the context of using it to extract rulings? Can you switch the function of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah? Any thoughts on that? It would be possible. But why would it be possible? Because Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah are not a dalil. When you study what evidences are in Islam, you see, kitab, sunnah, ijma', qiyas. Nobody says anything about Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Not even adilla mukhtalaf fiha. How can we use it as an evidence when it's not actually an evidence? It's just a group of rulings where we took out a common denominator, a common quality. How can we then go and reuse that for a different function? Any thoughts?
Because it is common.
Yeah?
Because it is common.
Because it's common. So because it's common, we can say that as soon as we see that quality, there's some basis for it. Okay. Does anybody have any other view to that?
It's like similar to qiyas.
It's a form of qiyas. That, you're applying analogy. You're saying, look, this ruling was there. This ruling is like it. We're going to do an analogy where we're going to shift the ruling of that scenario to this scenario as well because of the commonality. Ahsan, that works. Anything else?
But the first place when the Qawāʿid were established is based on something which was...
Ahsan. So that these rulings are established on evidence. We are just recycling those evidences, but not even individually. We're recycling them in mass, right? And then we're just applying it to another scenario. So since it's rooted in evidence, in reality, we're reusing rulings that are established in evidence. That works as well. Any other ideas?
Have the reasoning.
Huh?
We have the reasoning.
You have the reasoning, it was established, the evidence is there. Okay.
For new problems.
Huh? You can use it as a solution for new problems. That was the question that we're looking at. So can we extract rulings that are, maybe they weren't covered in the older books, they're contemporary issues of fiqh. Can you apply it to reduce rulings from the Quran and Sunnah to use as evidence to derive out rulings from it? So we'll go through this masala quite quickly, inshallah ta'ala, and some of the views of the scholars of Islam with regards to that. I hope the question is clear. The question, if you want to rephrase it, is هل يصح الاحتجاج بالقواعد? So is it a valid form of utilizing as evidences? Is it a valid form of utilizing as evidences? So number one, if you wanted to categorize it, and remember we've covered these categories before, we've said that quite simply, there are principles that are in and out of itself what? Evidences. Al-umur b'maqasidiha is just a hadith. It's just being phrased differently. Right? Al-dhararu yuzal is hadith la dharara wa la dhirar, for example. These are literally a hadith. They're literally a hadith. So why shouldn't you just reuse that? Because it's literally a hadith. So that category, which is what we mentioned earlier, which is the principles الذي مصدره نص, that its source is a individual text from the Quran, the Sunnah, and that there is no khilaf, there is no debate. If you were to use the principle al-umur bimaqasidiha as an evidence, you would quite literally just be using a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. There shouldn't be. So it's like saying, is there a debate regarding using a hadith as a proof? Right? So that is concrete. That's the first scenario. Al-hadith alladhi masdaruhu nas yasih al-ihtijaj bihi. But one thing you have to remember is, you're not using the principle as a proof in this scenario. You're using what? You're using the proof, the hadith. So using the evidence in this scenario. The principle is just to rephrase so that you could study the science within it. But in essence, you're using the proof. Outside of that, right? Outside of that, anything other than that, which remember that any other principle where the proof is not an isolated hadith, is not an individual text from the Quran and the Sunnah. What do we do with that? This is where the discussion amongst the scholars of Islam begin. I want to mention two scenarios here as well. We have what is used as, or what is said to be al-istidlal, and we have something else that is said to be isti'nas. They differ subtly, and so be aware. Al-istidlal is a primary evidence. So it's when you say, the ruling for this is this, and the evidence for it is this. So the evidence directly resulted in you deriving at that ruling. Sah? Isti'nas differs. Isti'nas is when there is an other isti'nas. Yeah. Isti'nas. It's when the evidence is there. There is a primary evidence. But you bring what you call a supplementary evidence. Okay? You bring a slightly, secondary sort of evidence to strengthen your argument. But the primary evidence has to be there. Now here, the first thing that you find in the books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is that the scholars of Islam agree that you are allowed to use Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah as a supplementary evidence. So you can use it as a form of isti'nas. And so what remains? Our discussion regarding al-istidlalu biha, using it as a primary evidence. If you have another evidence, but you're just saying, this ruling is, the proof of it is this statement from the Quran or this text from the Sunnah. Alongside that, it's also an application for this qa'idah. That would be fine. Nobody debates in the legitimacy of such an argument. Does that make sense? The first opinion with regards to using it as an evidence. So the debate now, we understand is, if you wanted to really ask the question of Hujjiyyat al-Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, what does it mean? It would literally mean, the question would be, if you wanted to really understand what we're talking about now, it would be using a principle that is not in and out of itself a text from the Quran and the Sunnah. Nor are you using it as a primary evidence, nor are you using it as a supplementary evidence. You're using it as a primary evidence. Is it a valid proof? What does valid proof here mean? Valid proof means that whatever rulings that you derive from it is an acceptable rule that you can worship Allah Ta'ala with. You can say that this is hukmullah. This is the ruling that is with Allah regarding this scenario. Right? So you also have to be aware of what you are saying when you say Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is a proof. It's a serious statement. You there in that scenario, you have two schools of thought. Is the question clear? Or do you want me to repeat it? Huh? The question is, in the circumstance of, alhamdulillah, all of this, as soon as we finish this last question, it gets a lot easier, I promise you. I can see a few eyes sort of rolling. It's really simple. Just the theoretical side sometimes requires a little bit of focus, but it gets a lot smoother. Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, using it as an evidence, means, number one, using principles that are not in and out of itself a text, meaning a statement derived from the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ directly. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ لَا ضَرَرَ وَلَا ضِرَارَ. These are hadith. If you were to use that, you would be using a hadith. This is not the discussion here. The discussion is also not to do with supplementary evidences. Meaning that if there is a primary evidence and you are just backing up that primary evidence with a principle in fiqh, this is also not the discussion. We are talking about using the principles of fiqh as a primary evidence. What is the ruling of that?
Which is not backed by a hadith or...
Yes, which is not backed by a hadith. In and out of itself. Directly. It's not a rephrased hadith. Okay? Does the question make sense? Yes. That scenario, can you say hukmullah, the ruling of Allah Ta'ala regarding this scenario or this incident is, this is the ruling, and the evidence for that ruling is this principle that I studied in Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Does the question make sense?
Yes.
This is where you have the two schools of thought. So the scenarios where there's an agreement, jot them down because they are all excluded. This is why it's important to know that. The scholars of Islam have two views with regards to that. The first view is أَنَّهَا لَا تَصْلُحُ أَن تَكُونَ دَلِيلًا. It cannot be an evidence. This is not sufficient. Allah Ta'ala, they would say, لَمْ يَتَعَبَّدْنَا بِالْقَوَاعِدِ. Allah Azza wa Jal did not make us worshippers of His by way of utilizing principles as a means of worshipping Him. Why? Principles were based on, remember we said earlier, bil-aghlabiyyah, based on the majority scenarios. There are exceptions, right? To every rule, there's an exception. If you are basing something on commonality and its frequent occurrence, and that this is how common, this rule is, how do you know that that one scenario that you've now said is the hukm of Allah is the one exception to this rule? So this view says this is absolutely incorrect and not okay. You can't do this. And there are individuals that this view is attributed to. A good example of that is Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, rahimahullah ta'ala, and it's attributed to Ibn Nujaym from the Hanafiyyah. And their argument is as follows, that ilm Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah consists of so many different istithna'at, exceptions, because every rule has an exception, right? There are so many times where even you and I will make a rule. We'll say in our house, for example, as a father, this is the new rule. And then your daughter does something, you're like, we'll give her the passport today. Subhanallah. It happens. Every person has that. And so there are exceptions to rules, both in Hayat al-Bashar, also in regards to the aspect of Allah Tabarak Ta'ala, there are exceptions as well. And those exceptions, there are reasons as to why they are exceptions. That's not our study for today. Remember we said that the study of that is ilm al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir. Okay, there is a science that studies exceptions, why they are exceptions. The point is that this view says that is not okay because it could be an exception. And so you would have attributed to Allah that which is not the ruling of Allah because you don't know whether it's the common rule or the exception. The next scenario, or the next opinion, second, al-qawl al-thani. This rule says, أنها تصلح للاستدلال. It is fine, it's okay, it's valid to use these principles as evidences. Even if they have exceptions, yes. Even if they have exceptions. And that does not harm the validity of this rule and that it forms a valid evidence. You find scholars like that, for example, Khalafi and Suyuti, both in their sort of like the essential works, they discuss this. The reason why I'm not gonna discuss now, but the reason why it's a valid evidence is actually in the principles that we're gonna study, which is that al-yaqeen la yazul bil-shak. They're saying that the default position is the common rule. If you're saying it's an exception, bring me the reason why it's an exception, right? That's how we deal with these scenarios. The exception is almost like it contradicts the base or the default rule. The asl was that the qa'idah should be applied wherever it is. The only reason why it was not applied was because of a reason that overpowered it. Now, unless you have that reason that overpowered it, why shouldn't it enter into the general rule? And so they would say, and this is where the topic of the qiyas comes in, right? Because even qiyas, this argument would default it. Qiyas is ilhaq al-shay bimathilatiha, that you apply something, the rule of something, to things that are similar to it, with obviously the possibility that this one scenario might vary. But you don't consider that possibility of variance. Why? Because the possibility of variance requires proof. And we're going to talk about this inshallah ta'ala a bit more bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala. But I want you to jot down here a principle. And with that we'll start the manzūma inshallah ta'ala. But the principle is أن الأصل في الشريعة عدم التفريق بين المتماثلات. الأصل في الشريعة, that the default rule and the principle and the foundation of the Islamic law is that it does not separate between two things that are similar. الأصل في الشريعة عدم التفريق بين المتماثلات. And so here, this is just another example of al-yaqeen la yazul bil-shak. We stick to that principle up until right now. What you said is a possibility, it's shak. You're telling us to use shak as a proof, which is wrong in the Sharia. The principles tell us that your opinion is invalid, which is a funny way of looking at it, because it's almost like we're talking about whether these principles form as an evidence, and they're using the principles as an evidence in the midst of it. Does that make sense? So, al-aslu fi sharia عدم التفريق بين المتماثلات. That the foundation of the Sharia is that we don't separate between two things that are similar to one another. And so we know that qiyas is valid because of that. And that, we use qiyas as a form of evidence. We made these qawāʿid up because we are seeking the commonality. The commonality is not just for you to learn classical fiqh with as well, but also to deal with contemporary situations as well. And all of this, qiyas is an evidence to use for new scenarios, the combination, commonality, it has a level of, validity to it, and that is why we study it to begin with. All of this goes to show you that we should stick to that principle. نبقى على هذا الأصل حتى يرد ما ينقله. Up until something that removes that foundation, this principle of the Sharia, this should remain. And this will, inshallah ta'ala, lead us on to the introduction of our book. How long do we have left? Or we're out of time? 6 minutes. Let's just go through one last topic, inshallah ta'ala, so we can just start the Manẓūmat after Salah, bi'idhnillahi tabarak ta'ala. The stages of the science of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. So the history of the science of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. We consider the science of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah to have gone through 3 major stages. The first stage is what we refer to as وجودها في النصوص. That is, Qawāʿid existed within the text of the Quran and Sunnah. As the Quran and Sunnah, the Quran was being revealed, the Prophet ﷺ was alive during the life of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and so on, up until we get to the next phase. This is the first stage of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. No person is burdened with more than they can bear. This is to do with al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. There's difficulty, ease has to come about, because too much burden, it removes that moral responsibility. إنما الأعمال بالنيات, the Prophet ﷺ says, الخراج بالضمان. Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhu would say, لا عفو في الحدود عن شيء منها. With regards to the legal penalties of Allah, there is no forgiveness with regards to it. That was a principle that was applied to all of these different scenarios that concerned these legal penalties of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala during that time up until after it. Shuraih al-Qadi would say, لا يقضى على غائب. مثلا, for example, all the different qadās, the rules, if somebody, one of the 2 individuals absent, we don't rule against it. And he needs to be present, he needs to provide his evidences so that we can get a valid rule or a judicial rule with regards to what happened between them. That applies to all these different scenarios that occur in Kitab al-Qadha. That's a principle where an early scholar mentioned. The next stage after that is the stage where we refer to it as it having found itself and it creeps into the earliest books of fiqh. And so this is the examples of that are like, Kitab للشافعي, for example, and it's filled with Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. You find, for example, Ibn al-Qas al-Maliki in his Talkhis, for example, and other such early books in al-Islam and in al-Fiqh, that they would consist of principles in the midst of discussions. So there is a discussion regarding a mas'ala, and a scholar squeezes in a qa'idah. And so this goes to show you as well that the greatest, and the author's going to say this anyway, so I'm not really going to think, but bear this in mind, that the greatest of the scholars of Islam, they would emphasize these qawa'id both in their learning, and then later on when they became teachers and taught as well, they would emphasize these principles. And that they were always hadira fi adhanihim. They're always there and present in their minds as they would write, author, teach, study and so on. So these principles, they're not random, they were there, and the greatest of the scholars of Islam emphasized them. This is not just a random occurrence. And this is the second scenario, which is تَنَاثُرُهَا فِي بُطُونِ الْكُتُبِ. It was just scattered and all over the books of fiqh. Then we get to the next phase after that, which is the first person that then authors a book in Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, and then from there on, this opens the door of this science. And so what this scholar essentially did is he goes through his madhab and he gathers all of these qawa'id that's just, all scattered and all over the place. And he decides to write a book on qawa'id. Who is this individual? Anybody want to take a guess quickly? No.
Qawāʿid.
Yeah. Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah, it's said to be Abu al-Hasan al-Karkhi. Abu al-Hasan al-Karkhi from the Hanafis. He died in the year 340. He died in the year 340. His book doesn't really have a name. Even today, quite often amongst the Hanafis, you find that, it's commonly called what? Usul al-Karhi. Usul al-Karhi. And roughly he mentions between Qawāʿid and Dhawābit about 39 principles. About 39 principles that he mentioned, rahimahullah ta'ala, in that book. It should be pointed as well, they're not all Qawāʿid Fiqhiyyah. Some of them are even Qawāʿid Usuliyah. So it does vary slightly. And then after that, you find books across all of the different madhahib that focus on the science of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah. Hanafis have books, Shafi'is have books, Malikis have books, Hanabil have books. And there are many, and the scholars of Islam heavily focused on this. And this continues and continues and continues up until the Ottoman Empire. And by the time the Ottoman Empire comes about, the Ottoman scholars under the tutelage and the command of Sultan al-Ghazi Abd Aziz Khan, which was one of the Salatin of al-Dawla al-Uthmaniyya, they create what is referred to as a majalla. A majalla today, if you want to translate it, it'd be like a magazine. But it's not really a magazine. It's actually a huge number of volumes of principles that the Qudat, the judicial system, needs to be aware of and its applications, so that they can unify the Qadha, the judicial system within the Dawla Uthmaniyya. This was a very important work, and it didn't just focus on, and it occurred for most of the 13th century of Islam, and it didn't just consider of even the Hanafi sort of principles and their applications. It was quite generic and universal to all the madhahib. It's called Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adliyah. Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adliyah. And it's from the huge and very important works of the Ottoman Empire. And so you have here, this is one of the things you should think about. What we're studying right now is not a science of, this is not science that even individuals would give importance to. Governments are giving importance to learning about these Qawāʿid, which goes to show you again the importance of these principles. Why is it important? We're going to talk about it shortly, bi'idhnillah. And it has to do with, again, al-aslu fi adam al-tafriq bayn al-mutamathilat. We can't have two rules for two individuals. Why? What happens if, I give one ruling for the same scenario to Tanweer and then to another one to Muhammad Ibrahim? What does that look like? What do you call that? Okay? It is a contradiction, yes. What else can it be? A contradiction? So the side that maybe I showed lenience to, or this or that, what would you say I've done towards them? It's unfair and it's not adil, a favor, a bias, right? It's called bigotry. It's called what? Double standards. And a rule of law cannot be like that. It has to be what? The key word here is consistency.
Can't it be customized to the person?
It can't be customized to the person. A rule has to apply to all of us, applies to none of us. And this is why, again, in Qadha, this is even more heavily emphasized. And the whole Dawla Uthmaniyya, because of the problem of all the variations that existed of different Muslims under their rule, they needed to work on this. And this is where you have Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adliyah. It was originally written in Turkish, and it has a very important explanation by a very famous scholar of that era, Sheikh Ali al-Haydar, rahimahullah ta'ala, who also wrote his explanation, which is Durar al-Hukam, Sharh Majallat al-Ahkam. And then it was later on translated into Arabic. Okay? And all of that is the part of the history of this science. This continues and continues and continues up until the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he passed away in the year 1376. So he lived towards the end of the last century. We're talking about, Shaykh al-Sa'di, rahimahullah ta'ala. What year is it this year, Hijri wise? 1446. How many years ago did he pass away?
109.
Huh?
109.
Huh?
109.
No, 1376, and now we're in the year 1446. 60 or 70? 70 years ago. And this was the direct teacher of Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen. And sometimes, I want to introduce that statement of 70 years ago. 70 years is a long time. But ideally, obviously, again, I've never met Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, but maybe some people could have met Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen that are in this room. You're talking about almost like 2 generations ago. And also, Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adliya would have been in the generation before that. And so this is a science that throughout our history, the scholars of Islam heavily focused on and gave a lot of time to. Some of the scholars of Islam, even the way that they author the books of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah is very strange, but it's very useful. So Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah has a very famous book called al-Qawāʿid al-Nūrāniyyah. Okay? Very famous book. What does he do in Qawāʿid al-Nūrāniyyah? He basically just covers, goes through Kitab al-Tahara, Salah, Zakah, Siyam, all the way to the end of fiqh. And in each chapter he mentions a load of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah that apply to certain scenarios. So it's just a book filled with Qawāʿid and its applications within the different chapters of fiqh. So even again, you have a great scholar like Shaykh al-Islam that would try to replicate a format of how to study this science in a way where it's applicable as well. And it has applications that you can read through. And all of that, like I said, are examples. And until today, the scholars of Islam are finding manuscripts and books that are written in the science of Qawāʿid al-Fiqhiyyah and doing tahqiq of them, verifying them and printing them. And this continues. The last thing, and with that I'll end, inshallah, we're out of time. Yeah. We're out of time. Khalas, we'll leave this, inshallah ta'ala. I had down like a couple of fawaid to do with the benefits of learning the science, and these are very important. The main benefits are about 4 of them. We'll mention them anyway, but the author rahimahullah only mentions about 2. So we'll mention that with the start of the Manẓūmat بإذن الله تعالى. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.